July 27th, 1694. The Mercer's Hall, London. A 54-year-old Scottish merchant named William Patterson has spent the last 3 years being laughed at. His idea struck most of the people he pitched it to as either naive or dangerous, and occasionally both. 2 monarchs had already passed on versions of it. The Amsterdam model was well understood, and nobody thought England could replicate it. But King William III has a problem that makes bad ideas suddenly look better. He has been at war with France for 6 years. The war costs roughly $5 million a year. England's existing mechanisms for government borrowing, short-term loans from goldsmiths, forced contributions, lottery schemes, are exhausted and unreliable. France, meanwhile, is borrowing more cheaply and more smoothly because Louis XIV has better financial infrastructure. The charter is signed. The Bank of England is established with $1.2 million in initial capital, lent to the Crown at 8% interest. The shareholders get a royal banking monopoly. The Crown gets reliable, long-term institutionalized credit at rates it has never previously obtained. Nobody in that room understood what they had built. They thought they were solving a short-term war financing problem. They were actually constructing the mechanism that would allow one island nation to outspend, outgun, and outlast every continental rival for the next 2 centuries. China understood this very well, and it started building its own version of it 15 years ago. Stay with me. The Bank of England's significance is usually taught in terms of monetary history, central banking, banknotes, lender of last resort. That framing is accurate and completely misses the point. The reason 1694 mattered was geopolitical, not monetary. Before the Bank of England, England's government borrowed from whoever would lend, at whatever rate the lender demanded, with repayment contingent on which monarch was in power and whether that monarch felt like honoring the previous one's debts. The goldsmiths who lent to Charles II discovered in 1672 that he simply stopped payment when it was convenient. The stop of the exchequer, it was called. $1.3 million in lender claims, simply suspended. The lenders had no recourse. The Crown's credit was destroyed for years afterward. The Bank of England solved this by institutionalizing the debt. When the English government borrowed from the bank, it was borrowing from a chartered corporation with thousands of shareholders, whose bonds traded on secondary markets, whose liabilities were held across the English propertied class, and whose failure would mean the simultaneous financial ruin of the people who staffed Parliament and ran the counties. The debt became politically impossible to repudiate because the creditors were now the political class itself. This lowered England's borrowing rate dramatically. France borrowed at 10 to 12%. England, after the bank was established and proved itself, borrowed at 3 to 4%. Over a century of nearly continuous warfare against France, that difference compounded into an almost incomprehensible strategic advantage. England could finance its wars for half what France paid. England could sustain longer campaigns, larger fleets, more distant commitments. France, with a larger economy and a larger population, was consistently outcompeted in the financial markets that determined how long wars last. The Bank of England did not win Britain's wars. It made them affordable. And making them affordable, over time, made them winnable. Now here is China, and I want you to watch not the surface, but the specific strategic function. Because China is not copying the Bank of England. It is building the mechanism that the Bank of England represents. Start with CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system. Launched in 2015, expanded steadily through the following decade, it now processes renminbi-denominated international transactions for over 1,400 financial institutions across more than 100 countries. Most people who have heard of it describe it as China's alternative to SWIFT, which is accurate but undersells it. SWIFT is a messaging system. CIPS is a settlement system. It actually moves money, not just the instructions. The distinction matters because it means CIPS can function as a parallel financial infrastructure, even in circumstances where Western sanctions have cut a counterparty off from dollar-denominated systems. In 2022, when Western governments froze Russian central bank reserves and cut Russian banks from SWIFT, the transactions that continued between Russia and China moved through CIPS. The mechanism worked, not at full volume, not without friction, but it worked. The architecture that China had been building for 7 years proved itself in the first serious geopolitical test it faced. This is England proving the Bank of England worked in King William's First War. Not a complete demonstration, an early one. The design was confirmed. Now, here's the critical part. The digital yuan, the ECNY, is not primarily a domestic payment system. It is structured from the ground up for cross-border use. Its architecture allows it to be integrated with other central bank digital currencies through the mBridge project, which already includes the central banks of China, Thailand, the UAE, and Hong Kong. The BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, provided the infrastructure for the project's development. The design goal is explicit. enable central bank digital currency transactions across borders without routing through any dollar-denominated correspondent bank. When that infrastructure is operational at scale, a country that wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, copper from Chile, or semiconductors from South Korea without touching the dollar-denominated system will have a functional alternative. Not a perfect one, not an immediately cheaper one, but a working one. This is the funded national debt being created, the institutional infrastructure that transforms geopolitical possibility into financial reality. Here is where the Britain 1694 parallel becomes structurally precise rather than merely analogous. The Bank of England's founding innovation was not technical. Plenty of people in 1694 understood how banks worked. Amsterdam had been demonstrating it for nearly a century. The innovation was institutional, creating a structure in which the English crown's creditors had sufficient political power that repudiation became structurally impossible. The debt was made permanent and reliable not by legal enforcement alone, but by aligning the interests of the creditor class with the survival of the institution. China's financial infrastructure build-out is doing the same thing, in reverse. It is not trying to make its own debt more reliable to foreign creditors. It is trying to make other countries' dependence on Chinese financial infrastructure sufficient that those countries have a structural interest in the system's survival and expansion. The Belt and Road Initiative has lent approximately $1 trillion to developing countries for infrastructure projects. Many of those loans are denominated in renminbi. Many of the projects are designed to use Chinese contractors, Chinese equipment, and Chinese technical standards. The countries that have borrowed and built are not simply debtors. They are participants in a financial and technical ecosystem whose expansion serves their own interests. Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Malaysia, they are not the Bank of England's shareholders, but they are, in a meaningful sense, its functional equivalent. Countries with a structural stake in the Chinese financial system's continued operation and expansion. This is what Britain's landed gentry were in 1694 when they subscribed to the bank's initial capital. Not altruists. Rational actors who understood that an institution they had funded was an institution that would serve their interests going forward. Here is the dimension that the financial press almost never frames this way. The specific competitive dynamic that makes China's 1694 moment relevant to every country that currently denominates its trade in dollars. England in 1694 was not trying to destroy Amsterdam's financial system. It was trying to build an equivalent one that served English strategic interests rather than Dutch ones. The Bank of England's success eventually displaced Amsterdam as the center of global finance, not through conquest, but through the gradual accumulation of financial infrastructure, institutional credibility, and the strategic advantages that cheaper government borrowing provided. China is not trying to destroy the dollar system. It is building infrastructure that serves Chinese strategic interests rather than American ones, and that, over time, gives countries that use it a reason to use it more. The same way countries that found their transactions running smoothly through London in the 18th century found themselves increasingly oriented toward London rather than Amsterdam. The dollar's reserve currency status rests on network effects. It is the standard because everyone uses it, and everyone uses it because it is the standard. Network effects are not permanent. They can be disrupted by patient, sustained infrastructure development that offers an alternative to enough participants that the alternative becomes viable. It took England roughly 50 years after 1694 to fully displace Amsterdam as the center of European finance. The process was not dramatic. It was incremental, transactional, and largely invisible until it was complete. China started building in 2015. It has been at it for 10 years. The infrastructure is not complete. The credibility is not established. But the architecture exists, and the geopolitical pressures that push countries toward using it, the sanctions risk that Russia's 2022 experience made concrete for every country with adversarial or potentially adversarial relations with Washington, are real and growing. Nobody was talking about this in 1694 either. They were talking about King William's War. This channel exists to find the architecture before the network effects shift. William Paterson's idea was laughed at for 3 years. The Bank of England charter was signed on a Tuesday in July 1694, and the financial press of the day described it as an interesting experiment in government finance. Nobody wrote that England had just built the mechanism that would make it the dominant global power for the next 2 centuries. China's CIPS, digital yuan, and Belt and Road lending infrastructure are being described today as an interesting experiment in financial sovereignty. Nobody is writing that China has built the mechanism that will challenge dollar reserve currency dominance in the 2040s. The architecture exists. The test case has run. The network is growing. Subscribe if you want to keep watching the architecture. And I want your argument in the comments. The Bank of England's success depended on institutional credibility. The proof that the English crown would not default on its new institutionalized debt. China's financial infrastructure faces the same credibility requirement. Does China have it? Or is the Belt and Road default rate and the LGFV crisis evidence that it doesn't? Drop your argument below. The clearest one gets pinned.